Russia's attack on Ukraine not only unleashed one of the world's worst conflicts in a generation, it exposed Europe's uncomfortable dependence on Moscow when it comes to energy. Despite a series of devastating sanctions and the pullout of many Western companies, Russian gas continues to flow towards the EU as millions of dollars stream eastward into Russian banks. That dependence has forced Europe to search for alternatives, and there could be a potential source close to home. Even before the conflict erupted in Ukraine, Turkiye and Israel had floated the idea of working together to transport natural gas from the eastern Mediterranean to Europe. Analysts say Israel's Leviathan field, which already supplies Jordan, Egypt and Lebanon, could be a key source for Europe's energy needs. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said last week that gas cooperation with Israel could be one of the most important steps for bilateral ties. Over the past year, Turkey and Israel have slowly started normalizing ties, which included a landmark visit by Israel's president to Ankara earlier this year. After a decade of mistrust, could these two regional powers put aside differences to work together on energy security? And to answer this, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Michael Doran. He's a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. And from Istanbul, Samuel Doveri Vesterbye. He is the director at European Neighbourhood Council. Gentlemen, welcome to Straight Talk and thanks for joining me. Samuel, although a long ways away, what are the prospects of Turkey and Israel cooperating on energy projects in the future? How likely it is to happen?
Well, I mean, due to the current Russia-Ukraine war and of course the promise by the EU and most NATO countries to phase out Russian gas, there is a real supply security problem and very high demand for alternative sources of natural gas, which of course affects countries like Germany, Italy, Eastern European countries like Bulgaria, disproportionately to the extent that they're high in dependence on Russian gas, ranging somewhere between 40% and up to full dependence. And that, of course, means that Israeli-Turkish gas cooperation in the Eastern Mediterranean becomes a viable, let's say, economic option, especially when taking into consideration both this high demand and the levels of supply which are found in the Eastern Mediterranean reserves, notably in Egypt, as well as in the territorial waters of Israel. So we're talking about the Zohr and Leviathan, Tamar, Aphrodisia reserves. And Zohr, which is run by the Italian energy company Eni, has become known as one, if not the biggest natural gas discovery in the Eastern Mediterranean. And of course, it's already pumping gas to the Israeli markets.
So, Michael, now that the East Med pipeline project has been called off, what's next for the region when it comes to energy? And has the cancellation of this pipeline project hastened this process, actually pushed Israel and Turkey to cooperate on gas supplies?
Well, that East Med pipeline was never commercially viable. And I think that the people at the top levels of the Israeli government understood that no company was ever going to come in and actually invest the money necessary to build it. But they were tied to the Greeks and the Cypriots through bonds of alignment due to the bad relations with Turkey and Israel. And the Israelis didn't want to be the ones to come out and say that this wasn't viable. So when the Americans canceled it, it gave the Israelis an opportunity to begin discussing seriously with the Turks.
Yes.
And this is good. There's good news on two levels. One, it makes more economic sense, but it also makes greater strategic sense for Israel and Turkey to be sorting out their problems together.
So, Samuel, we know talks have been ongoing since Israeli President Isaac Herzog visited Ankara last month, and decisions could follow in the coming months on a proposed route. What's next moving forward? What are the likely obstacles that the two countries face?
Well, I mean, I think the first question which occurs is, will it be a pipeline or will it be an LNG option? I also share the view that the LNG terminal is the more likely option, but I would like to, of course, explain what the options are. One option is this idea of Egyptian-Israeli gas going inland and through an Arab gas pipeline. That, of course, is highly unlikely because of Syria and because of all the complications that are linked to Syria, and not alone to say that, of course, it would be in competition with Russia, which has a very strong relationship with Assad and so forth.
Yes.
Another option is via sea, and and that pipeline indeed is not very viable. It would have to go through Cypriot territorial waters, which would complicate a lot of things as well, and there would probably not be enough backing around it. And then finally, there's another option, which is sending gas either to Egypt or to Turkey and creating gas hubs through LNG and terminals in which that could then be distributed from there. So those are perhaps the more viable options on the medium term.
So, I mean, since LNG is very costly to manage, and it's much more expensive compared to transporting gas through a pipeline, you say this project is not viable?
I think LNG is more expensive than pipeline. That's for sure. On average, the terminal LNGs in terms of cost range between 350 million and go well beyond 600 million to construct. But I think there is not only cost to take into the equation when considering the Eastern Mediterranean. There are a few other factors which matter enormously as well. And because of the high level of energy prices and the very, very high level of demand from European and Turkish markets, there is a real option to bring that energy to the consumer markets through LNG.
So, Michael, as just Samuel mentioned, any subsea pipeline would need to cross the waters of a divided Cyprus or Syria. Could this project provide a diplomatic opening between Ankara and these two countries, and could Israel play a facilitating role here?
Well, that's what I would hope for, and I would hope that the United States would also play that role. And I think that it shouldn't go through for strategic reasons. It shouldn't go through Syrian waters. It should go through the Cypriot waters. And I would hope that Israel and the United States could play a facilitating role to come up with a mechanism to get over the diplomatic and political difficulties of making that happen.
So, Samuel, can East Med gas supplant Russian gas, given the Leviathan field already supplies Israel, Jordan, and Egypt? I mean, could Israeli gas be a game changer in the region?
I mean, to answer your question very directly, yes. But I think there's a follow-up question which is equally important and economically very important for investments, which is East Med gas viable without Zohr in the Egyptian territorial waters? My opinion is that it probably isn't. And as a result, it's also very, very important to get the Italian energy company Eni, as well as the Egyptian side on board in order to manage the relations between Egypt and Turkey, which of course notoriously have had difficult relations over the years, because it is not necessarily enough gas in the Israeli territorial waters without taking into account Zohr, which would make that project fundamentally viable.
So, Michael, how would a regional cooperation between Greece, the Greek Cypriot sector, and Egypt in the Eastern Mediterranean be impacted if such a project between Turkiye and Israel was to be realized?
Well, I think it would reduce a lot of the tensions that we've seen over the last few years. A major source of the tension was the plan for the East Med pipeline. The great thing about money is that it allows everyone to get a share in the profits here. And I think that alone, that doesn't solve all problems. We know that. I don't want to be naive, but it creates at least an opportunity to have the discussion.
So, Samuel, as we're talking about Europe trying to wean off its dependence from Russia, there is another project coming up to bring, with Israel helps, gas from autonomous region of northern Iraq to Turkey and then to Europe. How viable is this project, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, from a purely engineering point of view, there's over 1 trillion cubic meters of gas in Iraq. Iraq has large gas reserves. So in that sense, of course, it's viable. Again, the problem becomes the political aspect. Northern Iraq, or KRG, already provides crude oil to Turkey, but that pipeline has had terrorist attacks. It's had a lot of litigation cases with regards to disputes between Baghdad and KRG. And of course, there is Iran. Every single time that Iran is circumvented in that region, it will utilize its proxies inside the country, which could create a lot of problems. So I think that political context is important to remember as well.
So we also know that, Michael, this project, according to some officials, this project or this plan also triggered Iran's missile attack on Erbil last month. Iran said it targeted Israeli facilities, but it turned out the Villas truck was used for meetings between the U.S. and Israeli energy specialists. So could such a pipeline threaten Iran's place as a major supplier for gas for Iraq and Turkey? And why do you think Israel wants to be a part of this project?
Well, that's one of the most fascinating things that we've learned in the last in the last few weeks. My assumption is that, and I have to stress, this is my assumption, is that because the Turks and the Israelis are talking about Israeli gas to Turkey, and there is already a pre-existing relationship of bringing Kurdish oil to Israel through Turkish territory to Ceyhan, I think that in terms of investors, but also in terms of the political arrangements, there's already a kind of a network to discuss these projects in tandem, and that's a tremendous threat to the Iranian government. I mean, the greatest thing that the Iranians fear is a Turkish-Israeli rapprochement, because Turkey and Israel are the two most powerful military. They're the two greatest military powers in the Middle East. Iran wants to keep them apart.
Yes.
One of the fascinating things that's been happening in the last few months and over the last year is a greater awareness in both Jerusalem and Ankara that Israel and Turkey have strategic and economic interests in common, particularly with regard to thwarting Iran. The missing factor here is an American policy that would facilitate the two of them, help them get over their differences, help them with the Egyptians and the Cypriots and so on.
Yes.
And I think we should all be telling Washington, wake up.
All right, gentlemen, unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.